Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today of the one-seat variant of the Fork in Time What If machine. I'm going to take a quick excursion back into a time for a brief episode today since I'm flying solo, and we're going to go back to 1620 in North America. We're going to look today at what would have been different if the original landing by the Pilgrims / Puritans in what later became to be known as Plymouth Colony and then modern Massachusetts in the United States. What if that initial landing had not succeeded? And so today we're going to look at the historical what-if proposition of what if there had been no successful arrival in 1620 of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. But before we explore that branch or fork in time, let's take just a moment here to hear from some of the folks that help make the show possible. We'll be right back. Taking just a quick break from the podcast here, it's Don.
Alexis.
And we're talking to you today about something that we both use and we both enjoy, and that is going to be what, Lex?
That's going to be Audible.
Audible. I've been using Audible. I was actually trying to think of this the other day, Lex. I think I've actually been using Audible now for almost 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Says something about my age, but also says something about how Audible has had sticking power. Because what Audible does is they are, I think, the leading provider of audio of all types of genres and all types of means on any device you want to listen to that audio on. So typically I think of that as being an audio book. But that's not the only thing, right, Lex?
Oh, no. They have podcasts. They have theatrical productions. Audible has tons, thousands of things you could listen to.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. And so we are both Audible users. In fact, I jokingly tell folks that I work with and that I talk to in my other life, my real life, all the time, that I'm pretty much now about the only way that I read is to be read to, no strain on the eyes. And I can do that very easily with Audible. So we have a special offer for A Fork in Time listeners. You can follow the link in the show notes or go to audibletrial.com/aforkintime, and you'll be able to take advantage of a free month, one free month. And what comes with that free month, Lex?
A free audio download.
Yeah, a free audio download. It's easy to say audio book, and
I almost did.
And you may choose an audio book, but it could also be, as Alexis said, there's all types of audio that can be found there. This is unabridged audio. It's a wide variety of fiction and nonfiction. They're associated with Amazon, which means one of the things that happens if you take advantage of the free offer and you happen to be a Prime member, you get not one but
2 credits.
2 credits towards Audible programs for that first month. Of course, there is a cost after the first month free trial, but it enables you to try the service to see if it's something that you'll like. You keep those titles forever. By the way, they allow you to return titles that you don't like or don't listen to. I have found them to be both on a customer service aspect as well as just a service to use aspect. One of my favorite things. Alexis and I both at various points in our professional lives have traveled a lot.
Yeah.
And what you sometimes think of Audible as the road trip companion, right?
Yeah, before I left on a trip, make sure you have an audiobook.
Yeah, and the cool thing there is you can do bookmarks, you can put notes, all the things you would want to do. So if you've been thinking about getting into audiobooks or audio materials of any type, we would certainly recommend Audible. And again, if you follow the links in the show notes or go as we described there to audibletrial.com/aforkintime, we get the credit for sending you there. You get the good stuff that Audible is, so we certainly would appreciate it. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don chairing the effort today. And as we mentioned before we went to the break there, what we're going to be looking at doing today is going back in time to 1620 in North America. And the event that we're going to use as our fork today, where we're going to branch in history, relates to the arrival of the Pilgrims, as they're commonly referred to in American history. These would be Puritans that were coming from England, and their arrival in what is now modern-day Massachusetts. So this is the arrival of the group of pilgrims that came over on the boat known as the Mayflower, and who landed originally in Provincetown on the tip of Cape Cod, and ultimately settled in the southern part of what we know as Massachusetts today on a modern map. So we're going to look at the historical what if that colony had not existed there. And so we're really going to explore, and do it probably fairly briefly, two alternative history timelines. One would be where they did in fact land there, but the colony failed. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that the colony initially faced. In fact, how they barely made it through that first winter. And it can be argued, although some of history has sort of now stylized or grandized this particular element, of how they probably would not have survived without the assistance of Native Americans who provided them some valuable understanding about how to make it through those first couple of years. The other alternative would be if they hadn't have landed there, but they'd landed where they originally were intended to land. One of the interesting aspects of this particular colonial exercise is they ended up settling in a territory that was not the original grant or not the original location where the colony was intended. And while it may seem like a small thing to say, well, what if they had just landed someplace else and been successful, understanding that geography does matter in history, and it matters in ways that can sometimes, where small changes can have a big effect, a little bit of the butterfly effect of just the location of something. And so today we're going to look at the two possibilities of what would have happened if the colony had failed. Of course, as we often do, we begin by talking about the what did. And the what did is an interesting story. It's a compelling story, again, that's been memorialized sort of in American lore for a long period of time. A group of those that were religiously persecuted in England, get permission to leave and sail over to found a colony in the New World, departing from Plymouth in England. They arrive after crossing in the latter part of summer and into the fall of 1620. They actually land on the shores of Cape Cod. This is not where they were originally supposed to land, and eventually they do move and settle across what would later become known as Massachusetts Bay, and settle in the area that we know of today, which is in the southern part of modern Massachusetts, and found the Plymouth Colony. 53 souls make the voyage across, and it's a very difficult endeavor in terms of what actually happens when they land. The winter that year was harsh. A number of the men, really all, the colonists were sick, and they barely eked out an existence with a large number of deaths in that first winter, coming through only with the help and aid of some of the Native Americans that were there. And so after that, they do eventually tend to thrive somewhat. Additional colonists come and they expand out, and eventually are absorbed in with other colonial groups that come into a larger colony that becomes to be known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then of course becomes the predecessor for what would later become the state of Massachusetts, both as an independent state and then later part of the United States. If you're not already familiar with this particular little segment of history, I'm not going to go into it in depth now, but we'll put several links inside of the show notes for you to be able to go and read that, including the Wikipedia article as well as others, to get some of the flavor and background there. While it's important to the historical what if, I don't want to spend a lot of time here covering that part of the historical what did. As I mentioned, though, there are two particular historical what ifs that I think are interesting to note. The first of those actually, let's take the one where they actually do survive as a colony, but they survive in the place where they were originally supposed to land. And here it's important to understand that where the colonists ended up is not where they intended to be. Of course, this being the age before GPS and before the ability sometimes to reliably navigate, particularly into areas that were less well known or that were new, they end up landing much further north than what they were originally granted their charter for and where they were supposed to be. In fact, the original location that they had been chartered for is the mouth of the Hudson River. Thinking through to modern times, it's sort of an interesting thought to think of, given the rivalry, for example, that exists not just in the sporting realm, but in other realms as well, economically, particularly even in the early parts of the colony, between what eventually became the city of New York and the city that became Boston. It's hard to imagine that the settlers that end up being in the area that we know as Massachusetts today were originally intended to be in the area of New York and New Jersey. But that's in fact where their original charter had been granted. And this would be to be under the guise or under the rules and regulations that were established for the Jamestown settlement, which had been founded in 1609, and essentially the larger Jamestown colonial effort, the Virginia Company. This was an expanding it north, and they were granted land after negotiating this charter to be there near the mouth of the Hudson. This was an area that the Dutch were already also active in, and in fact, it's the arrival of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts and the potential for them to have arrived there in the area of the mouth of the Hudson that caused them to actually form their settlement on the island of Manhattan. And so a lot of what we know of as being the modern geography of the United States, the modern urban geography of the United States, ties back to this era of colonial settlement. And the original intent had been for this particular colony, what became the Plymouth Colony, to be much further south than what we think of today as being New York or New Jersey. And in fact, one of the most interesting elements of this change in course and change in landing point is that it also had an impact on how they were organized politically. Now, remember, this is a group of religious refugees that had fled England, actually to the Netherlands, and then had come back from the Netherlands and had actually departed after obtaining the permissions to come and to get these grants and these charters to come and settle. They'd come back and had left from England, originally planning to be in 2 vessels, again, without going into the whole element of the fact that there should have been the Speedwell coming with the Mayflower and a lot of the other challenges that were there. Again, they were supposed to land on the northern fringes of what had been the Jamestown settlement into an area that had been previously explored by the Dutch, but not yet fully occupied by the Dutch. This was also part of the reason why the British Crown, the English Crown, was so willing to grant them the power to come, was to put them in a place where they would be able to occupy territory that was favorable, or potentially would be favorable to the Dutch versus being housed in favor of England. And so part of what goes on is when they actually don't make their actual destination, when they end up having to temporarily stop across Massachusetts Bay in Provincetown on the tip of Cape Cod, is that there's actually a dispute that arises among the settlers about how this is going to work, because they're not actually going to be landing where they're supposed to be. Some wanted to actually come back or eventually just find their way down to where they were supposed to be. Others said, we're here, we've scoped out this land, perhaps this is where God intended us to be. And so they actually formed the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact is an interesting document, and so if they actually land where they're supposed to land, they would have just followed the procedure that was there. They would have fallen basically under the same rules and procedures. They would have been indirectly connected with eventually what became the Virginia House of Burgesses that's coming out of the Jamestown colony. But having landed so much further north and now independent and separated from the existing English settlement, which was in the Virginia territory, the Mayflower Compact actually represented a form of self-government. And it took on a different form and structure of government than likely would have been undertaken by the colonists had they landed where they're supposed to be. And so because they are a religious group, there's a little bit more inclined towards practicing the sharing of property and the sharing of responsibilities and resources. They actually form what is, for that day, a more liberal concept of who should have representation and how things should work. And so later we will look back, particularly inside of American political formation, looking back at the Mayflower Compact as being a unique document and some of the principles that are brought forward and eventually find their way into Massachusetts Bay Colony and how things function and what eventually becomes the state of Massachusetts, is that if you don't have them land there, it's not just that they're geographically different. They're now down in the Virginia, what later would become Delaware, the New York area. But what you actually find is that they have created their own sort of form of government and are slightly independent from the other English possessions that are in the New World. And so I would argue that one of the changes by landing at the wrong place is they actually end up creating a different style of government, colonial government, in the United States that eventually, or the area that would become the United States, that will eventually be somewhat distinct and somewhat different from some of the other regional or sectional things that had grown to be while the United States was still a colony of England, of Britain. And so the change in the landing place alters the political climate in the short term very little, but in the long term creating a new political philosophy that is slightly different from that that's enjoined in the other English colonies, plays itself out, and certainly by the time of the American Revolution and the foundation and formation of the new United States post the American Revolution, finds its way into the concepts of what eventually becomes the United States Constitution and how the United States is governed. Another element of the relocated colony, being relocated from the intended location along the Hudson River up to the area in modern-day Massachusetts, is that there would not have been the same English presence in the same timing in the area that we know of as Massachusetts. And during that particular period of time, there was already French influence in the areas of Canada, what would be modern-day Canada, and French traders that were trading with the Indians, fur traders, and others that were coming down. And so it's easy to imagine that if there had not been an English intrusion, whether you consider the Puritan intrusion to be accidental or, as some have argued from history, perhaps intentional, into the area that we know of as New England today, there would have been much more of an opportunity for the French to expand their influence further south from where they were in what we know of today as modern-day Canada. And again, as we've already mentioned, that the Dutch could have expanded their influence further north from the establishment of a settlement there on the island of Manhattan. And so what you could have had, ironically, given that we know of the region today as New England, Massachusetts and Maine and Connecticut and the six states that eventually formed the area that we know of as New England today, is that there may not have been much England to be in what we know as New England today. It could have been much more occupied and influenced by French and by Dutch influences, such that most of the English settlement in the New World would have been contained from the area maybe up as far as modern-day New York, where the colony was originally intended to be, but certainly much further south. And of course, if you go far enough south, then you encounter the areas that were under Spanish influence. And so when we typically look, for example, at a map of where English colonization grows to by the middle of the 18th century, again, the time, let's say, of the American Revolution, we find that there are English colonies that span all the way from the areas of South Carolina and Georgia up through Maine. However, if we think about a different scenario in terms of how that would have been settled in the preceding centuries before that, it's easy to imagine that much more of the English concentration may have been in the southern part of that particular tranche. And of course, as is well written, you see there are distinct differences in the economy of what would be the southern states and the northern states. Particularly with the southern part of what would eventually become the United States, would become those colonies that would become independent, being much more agrarian in its focus because of the climatology and because of just the way that natural resources worked, while the northern areas tended to be more around trade and economic exercises along the idea of mercantilism. And so what you end up with there is not only a difference potentially in political philosophy, but if you have a more compact English colonial settlement in the New World that is more in the southern half of what we know from the real history timeline, you may have had a different character of those colonies. There would have been fewer colonies. There might not have been as much of the agitation towards revolution, which tended to be a little bit more fermented in the northern colonies, for example, Massachusetts being one of the early places where the American Revolution breaks out, than it was so in the southern colonies. And so while it's tough to know exactly what the influence would have been just on the English part of colonization, and then ultimately potentially would there have been an American Revolution that would have been similar to what we actually see, you definitely would have seen a different character to much of the English settlement in the New World. Alternatively, you might argue that, well, you still would have had the same character of that settlement, it's just that you would have had different people in different places. So you may have had much more of that influence. The Puritan religious influence may have had a different impact had it been more prevalent inside of the areas that we know of in modern times as Virginia or the Carolinas. But I do tend to think that it probably was much more the case that they would have been absorbed into the larger economic natures of those colonies versus being able to be a distinct, different type of colonial experience as they were in the real timeline. And so one of the things that certainly happens with a misdirected colony, Massachusetts colony, is that I think you definitely change the nature of English colonial life prior to the American Revolution, and then you might even argue you might not have had the same type of output from the American Revolution. Of course, it could be argued that if you had more shifting of the settlement southward than we had in the real time, that you may have had more of a shifting of the actual influence. And so while you may have had, from a coastal perspective, much more of the English colonization focused along the southern half of what we eventually think of as being the United States by the time of the American Revolution, is you might have seen a much larger push inland from those areas where English settlements were taking place. And so you may have seen more influence coming inland during that particular period of time. There was, of course, obviously some push inward across the entire spectrum from north to south along the English colonies, which became the United States. But you may have seen a much more profound push inland if there had been essentially a smaller window, north-south window, for those colonists to be funneled into. Of course, the other thing that's difficult to figure out is what would have been the influence created by the vacuum of not having as much English settlement in the area that eventually becomes New England. And so with that being much more French in its influence, what would have been the nature, for example, of one of the events that led to the American Revolution, which were the events in the colonies after the French and Indian War, which of course was the North American connection to the 7 years, in the sense of if France had had more of a presence in the New World that was further south, would that have changed the nature of how the conflict may have been fought in the New World? Could that have changed the way that that would have played out in the New World in such a way that there would have been a different outcome for what eventually again become the independent colonies under the real timeline, become America in the real timeline, but may not have actually reached that point for different kinds of reasons, as I've already described, if they've been pushed more southernly in their focus geographically, or if there had been a larger French or Dutch influence. It's interesting to think about what would have happened had there been more interaction between the English and the Spanish in the New World because of the need to push further south into areas like Florida. For example, could there have been conflict that would have arisen that would have been a conflict on North American soil that would have existed more between England and Spain over possessions and colonization of the New World, simply because England would have had a larger presence that was much closer to the Spanish presence and the interaction that might have happened between the two. The other historical departure that I think is worthy of some consideration is simply the non-survival of the colony where it actually did land. And if you know the story or read the story of the struggles that the colony had to overcome during those initial years, it's quite a story of enduring hardship and enduring through struggle. So imagining that they did not survive that first winter, or perhaps didn't survive even the second year that they were there because of the hardships that were being faced, you look at the scenario where what would have happened with future colonization from persecuted religious groups. So we'll just at least focus on, for the sake of simplicity, additional Puritan groups. And so one possibility would be that there would still be separatists and Puritans and others who felt that they needed to leave England because of religious persecution, who would have found their way to the New World. And so one possibility is you simply have just another set of Puritans other than those that formed the Plymouth Colony who find their way and end up landing at the appropriate place. And so what you sort of have there is the concept of the same colony, only now diverted, as I discussed in sort of the first differential. It's just with a different group of settlers, and it diverts slightly later. And so you continue to have many of the same outputs there, most likely with the inflow of Puritan and other religious refugees and religious colonists coming into the territories that had been part of what would become Virginia, that were part of the other English colonial efforts that were happening in the mid-Atlantic and then further south in the current thinking of how you think of the modern United States today. So one possibility would simply be a delayed and diverted again instance of Puritan migration and settlement into the New World. The other possibility is that the word essentially may have gotten back that this was a hard life. And so you may have seen some of those Puritans looking for entirely different places to go. I've seen historians theorize the possibility of actually settlements that would have been more towards the Caribbean elements of the New World versus the more traditional parts of mainland North America. Or they may have found other places inside of Europe, as they already had, to go and seek out and create new communities that were still in Europe and did not require the dangers of a crossing of the sea and being able to find success and thriving in the New World. So under that historical flow, you would also still not have the influence that was uniquely brought by Puritans and their style of congregational and ecclesiastical organization that bled over into political organization in the New World. or you would have had it be just a subset of what was going on inside of the colonies, like Jamestown, what eventually becomes Virginia. And so there would have been influenced that in an entirely different exercise of democracy that was represented by the Virginia House of Burgesses. Or you might have actually seen that form of political and religious community thought spread into the Caribbean in an entirely different way. And so, again, you still have the same outcome, or potentially changing what eventually would become what what is known to us as the English colonial life that existed in North America pre-American Revolution. And I think you certainly would argue that, again, you have an influence on the American Revolution itself, whether it actually happens or whether you actually see just it happening and being expressed in a different way. And so in either scenario, sort of in either one of these forks, removing the influence of what eventually becomes, both because of religious nature and also of a political nature, what we know of as New England, both in the colonial area, an era, and in the area of the young United States as a republic. When you change that, I think you do change a great deal. Certainly, if you carry that all the way down to a modern context today, again, you probably have a different map of the United States, and the area that we know of today as Boston, or the areas that we know of today as being in Massachusetts, actually may fall under British domination, as they ultimately did, but you actually have a different formation that takes place. And so you may have a much more populous, for example, Eastern Canada than you do today, influenced in different ways, still perhaps influenced by its French heritage, but even in its British heritage, and then in gaining its independence, may look very different in terms of its geographic scope than it does today. And with a change in that geographic scope, and maybe the economic scope of what's there because of what was possible either through fishing or through industrialization or the other things that we come to know as being part of New England in the real timeline, those benefits and those elements may have been transferred to Canada. Of course, that's always assuming that you would have ended up with the same things if you started with a different start. You may not have seen as much of that merchant element to New England had it been under the French, or had it been under the Dutch, or had it eventually developed later in a different way under the English. In fact, one of the things that's suggested very often is that, imagine, if you will, that the Plymouth Colony settlers, the Puritans in 1620, decided to come down and occupy the area that they're supposed to occupy. Again, this sort of change, this deflection in terms of the location there. What would have happened if a subsequent colony in the area that we know of today as being New England, in the Massachusetts area, had actually been a crown colony instead of actually being the type of colony that was actually formed as a result of the Mayflower Compact, and then was later altered as a combination of things came together to be Massachusetts Bay? You might argue a different, again, type of politics and a different type of influence there. And remember, this is a period of time in English history where there's a lot of change that's going back and forth in terms of the monarchy, in terms of the periods of times of the Glorious Revolution, which is going to follow shortly after this, where you have this tremendous amount of change and back and forth that's going on in England that was spilling over in various ways to how it expressed itself in the New World in terms of how things were being colonized, how things were being founded, and how things were being governed. And so once you change one small deflection of time, going all the way back to 1620, and then change maybe the flow of the different groups that came to the different parts of the New World, you certainly have the opportunity to reach the point where what you ultimately end up with is a very different New World than what you started with. So I hope that concludes and provides a little bit of a food for thought today as we talk about the potential for what would have happened if in 1620 there had not ultimately been a successful colony that grew out of the landing of the Pilgrims and eventually coming into Plymouth Colony, and how things might have changed both in the short term inside the New World, but also how that may have moved forward in history. So certainly probably didn't cover all of the potential ways that things could have forked out from there, but hopefully have sparked enough interest and enough thought that you may think through and may come up with other ideas about how things might have been different. By the way, if you did, we would welcome you to visit us at our website. That's www.aforkintimepodcast.com. As always, there's an opportunity there to provide feedback. I'd love to hear your thoughts on maybe things that I missed or things that you think I got wrong in this particular exploration of this alternate timeline, or certainly, as we always talk about there, the other ways that you can interact with us here at A Fork in Time as we build our alternate history community, making topical suggestions, ways that you can promote the podcast, going back and listening to past episodes, all the things that exist there at the website. And of course, if you are so inclined to do so, to support us financially, you'll find the links there to our Patreon page, and you can do so as well. But as we always do, we want to close out today saying that what we appreciate the most and thank you for the most is your time and attention, and giving us some of that today. And that's one of the most valuable gifts that you can give us. And we're thankful to have you as a listener here to A Fork in Time. So this is Don closing out this episode, just closing it out the way we always do, reminding you that if you encounter that fork in time, our suggestion is to take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.